Ruth Ellis stepped into the restaurant as if entering a cathedral, her heels striking the polished wood floors with a rhythm that resonated beyond sound. The air was rich with quiet luxury, warm, golden light spilling over tables set with pristine linens. The low murmur of polite conversation punctuated by the delicate clink of glasses. To most, it was an ordinary evening, another meal in a city that forgot itself in the glow of its ambition. But to Ruth, this was sacred ground. She paused at the threshold, smoothing the folds of her navy dress, the kind she wore when dignity demanded armor. Tonight, she was here for a celebration not hers, but her son Marcus's. Marcus, who had wrestled opportunity from reluctant hands, had built this restaurant with vision, grit, and no shortage of faith. It was his gift to the city, a sanctuary where anyone could walk through the door and feel, if only for a moment, like they belonged. The hostess greeted her with a bright, practiced smile, leading her to a table by the window. Ruth's gaze swept across the room, noting the small symphony of details, the flowers carefully arranged in glass vases, the servers moving with precision. Pride swelled quietly in her chest. But pride was a complicated thing, and tonight, it shared space with something sharper, heavier, a nagging sense that the world never really celebrated people like her without reservation. As Ruth took her seat, she felt the subtle shift in the room. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there. The flicker of eyes lingering too long, the faint stiffening of shoulders. She had seen it 1,000 times before, in classrooms and churches, on buses and sidewalks. She had grown accustomed to it, though it never ceased to wound. The waitress approached a young woman whose face carried the harried impatience of someone eager to be elsewhere. "Water?" she asked brusquely, not looking Ruth in the eye. Ruth nodded, her smile soft but unwavering. "Yes, please." The waitress set the glass down without a word, her hands quick and thoughtless, and disappeared into the bustle. Ruth watched her retreat, the moment a small stone cast into the still waters of the evening. Time passed in uneven stretches. Ruth sipped her water, savoring the view from her window, a city alive with light and motion. Oblivious to her waiting, the first course arrived, a salad delivered without ceremony. It was fine, she thought, but as the minutes turned into an hour, the meal stalled. Plates came and went around her, other diners receiving their entrees with ease. Ruth remained unseen, or perhaps simply unacknowledged. She raised her hand once, twice, to signal the waitress. Each time, the response was the same, a fleeting glance, a deliberate turning away. Ruth's patience, carefully honed over decades, began to wear thin. Finally, the waitress returned, her steps reluctant, her tone clipped. "What is it?" she asked, her eyes sliding over Ruth like oil over water. Ruth inhaled slowly, steadying herself. "I've been waiting some time for my entree. Could you check on it for me?" The waitress's mouth twisted, the smallest hint of a smirk curling at its corner. "The kitchen's busy," she said. "It'll come out when it's ready." The words were light, dismissive, but they carried the weight of a history Ruth knew too well. She met the waitress's gaze now, holding it with quiet intensity. "I see," she said, her voice as steady as a still pond. As the evening wore on, the slights accumulated like drops of water wearing away stone. The waitress's laughter rang out at a nearby table, easy and open in a way Ruth knew she would not extend to her. Diners who had arrived long after Ruth were served their meals promptly, their servers attentive and warm. She was left alone, her solitude sharpened by the noise of the room. The waitress returned once more, this time with a plate finally in hand. She set it down without apology, the motion abrupt, and muttered something under her breath. Ruth caught the words, faint but unmistakable. People like her, always expecting special treatment. Ruth's hand stilled on the tablecloth, her fingers tightening imperceptibly. The room seemed to shrink around her, the air suddenly thick with an invisible weight. She looked up, fixing the waitress with a gaze that held years of unspoken truths. "What did you say?" The waitress hesitated, her smirk faltering, but only for a moment. "Nothing," she said, turning on her heel. Ruth sat in silence, her thoughts churning beneath her composed exterior. This was not new. This was not rare. But tonight, it was personal in a way she could not dismiss. She glanced toward the entrance, half expecting Marcus to appear, his steady presence a balm for her rising anger. Instead, she found herself alone with the echoes of a larger truth, that even in places built by their hands, people like her were often made to feel like strangers. She had come here to celebrate, to taste the sweetness of her son's triumph. But instead, the bitterness of the world had followed her inside. And yet, Ruth did not rise, did not leave. She remained seated, her back straight, her chin high. She would wait for Marcus, for her meal, for the quiet vindication that comes not from anger but from endurance. She would wait, because waiting was its own act of defiance, its own declaration of belonging. And when Marcus arrived, as she knew he would, the quiet storm brewing within her would have a witness. Time has a way of stretching itself thin in moments of silent injustice. Ruth Ellis, seated alone at her windowside table, felt the minutes unfurl like a slow, deliberate tide. The soft clinking of cutlery and murmur of conversation around her played out as though on a distant stage, where others performed a seamless ballet of civility. But Ruth was no part of that dance tonight. Tonight, she was the uninvited guest at a table she had every right to claim. Her salad, wilted and dressed with indifference, had come and gone. The promise of her main course lingered somewhere in the ether. Around her, plates of vibrant entrees flowed freely to other tables. Diners laughed and exchanged warm thanks with their attentive servers, the choreography smooth and practiced. But at Ruth's table, the space remained conspicuously bare. The waitress, Emma, moved like a specter in the room ever present, yet always just out of reach. Ruth watched her from the corner of her eye, noting the ease with which Emma leaned over tables, the brightness of her smile when engaging other patrons. The contrast struck a familiar chord in Ruth, one she wished she didn't recognize so easily. It was the subtle sort of exclusion, the kind so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life that it often went unnamed, though never unnoticed. When Ruth finally raised her hand to beckon Emma, the gesture was met with a deliberate delay. The waitress approached with the kind of reluctant gait one reserves for obligations, her expression already set in a mask of irritation. "Yes," Emma said flatly, her voice devoid of warmth. Ruth kept her tone measured, her words careful. "I've been waiting for my entree for some time. Could you check on it, please?" Emma exhaled sharply, the sound heavy with impatience. "The kitchen's backed up," she said, offering no further explanation. Ruth met the young woman's gaze, her own calm but unwavering. "I see. Could you let me know when it's ready?" Emma shrugged, an exaggerated motion that bordered on mockery. "Sure," she said, turning away before Ruth could respond. The waitress's indifference stung more than any overt slight. It was the kind of dismissal that spoke volumes without raising its voice. Ruth sat back in her chair, her mind turning over the unspoken rules that govern such interactions. She had lived long enough to understand that the most cutting forms of prejudice rarely announced themselves. They thrived in gestures, in omissions, in the quiet refusal to see someone as fully human. The room carried on as though nothing had happened, and perhaps, to most of the diners, nothing had. Ruth noticed a couple seated nearby, their server laughing at some shared joke. Another table across the room erupted into applause as a birthday cake arrived, its candles flickering with promise. She felt herself slipping further into the background, a shadow in a room of light. Emma reappeared at a table adjacent to Ruth's. Her demeanor transformed. She crouched slightly, meeting the diners at eye level, her voice warm and lilting as she recited the evening's dessert options. The contrast was jarring, though Ruth had no need to question it. She knew the answer already. When Emma finally returned to Ruth's table, she carried a plate of food with the same careless ease she had displayed earlier. She set it down with a thud, her movements abrupt, her eyes refusing to meet Ruth's. "There you go," Emma said, her tone clipped. Ruth glanced down at the dish. It was lukewarm, the edges of the sauce already beginning to congeal. She looked up, her voice steady but pointed. "This doesn't appear fresh." Emma's smirk returned, faint but unmistakable. "It's fine," she said. "You're just being picky." The words landed heavier than Emma could have known, or perhaps she did know. Ruth leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but weighted with meaning. "I'd like to speak to your manager." For the first time, Emma hesitated. A flicker of something, perhaps fear, perhaps defiance, crossed her face. "He's busy," she said, but her tone betrayed her unease. "Then I'll wait," Ruth replied, her words carrying a finality that left no room for argument. As Ruth sat back, the quiet tension in her chest began to build into something more resolute. This was not just about a cold plate of food or an inattentive waitress. This was about the unspoken hierarchy that governed spaces like this one. The invisible calculus that determined who was worth accommodating and who was not. Ruth had seen it play out in countless ways over the years in schools, in offices, in neighborhoods that changed as soon as families like hers moved in. The injustice tonight was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't the target of it. And that, Ruth realized, was what made it so insidious. It was the kind of harm that could be denied with a smile, dismissed as a misunderstanding, buried under a mountain of plausible deniability. But Ruth would not let it pass unnoticed. She had spent too many years teaching children to stand tall, to demand their place in the world, to shrink now in the face of such quiet disdain. She straightened her posture, her chin lifting slightly as she waited for the manager to appear. The air around her seemed to hum with an unspoken challenge, a quiet assertion that she would not be moved, not tonight, not here. And in the stillness of that moment, Ruth knew she was not just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the countless others who had been dismissed, overlooked, or made to feel small in places where they deserved to be celebrated. This fight, Ruth understood, was not new. It had always been hers. And tonight, she would claim her seat at the table, no matter how long it took. It began as a murmur, faint and indistinct, like the rustling of leaves before a storm. Ruth Ellis could feel it building, not in the voices around her, but in the tension coiling tightly in her chest. The polite veneer of the restaurant, with its soft lighting and hushed tones, was beginning to fray, and though the room itself carried on, Ruth knew the fault lines were already forming beneath the surface. The manager arrived at her table, a tall man with a crisp suit and the slightly worn expression of someone used to smoothing over discomfort. He introduced himself as Thomas, his voice warm, professional, but with a sharpness that suggested he was already preparing for whatever this situation might demand. "How can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, His words edged with the subtle condescension reserved for those whose complaints are presumed trivial. Ruth did not rise to the bait. "Your waitress," she began, her voice steady, "has been dismissive all evening. I've waited far longer than others for my meal, and when it arrived, it was cold. But it wasn't just the service." Her words. Ruth paused, her gaze holding his. Her words crossed a line. Thomas frowned, glancing toward the waitress station where Emma lingered. Her back turned, but her body taut with the kind of feigned nonchalance that betrayed her awareness of the conversation. "I see," he said slowly, though Ruth could tell he didn't yet see anything at all. "What, exactly, was said?" he asked, the question delivered with the careful neutrality of someone walking a tightrope. Ruth's voice remained calm, though her hands tightened against the edge of the table. She suggested that people like me expect special treatment, that we don't work for what we have. She didn't say it outright, but I think you know exactly what she meant. Thomas hesitated, the weight of her words settling uncomfortably between them. "I'm sure she didn't mean it that way," he said finally, his tone placating. Ruth raised an eyebrow, her patience thinning. "And what way, exactly? Do you think she meant it?" The room felt heavier now, the hum of activity around them a stark contrast to the charged quiet at their table. Ruth could sense the shifting dynamics, the glances cast in their direction, subtle but telling. This was how it always began. A moment of discomfort spiraling into something larger, something unavoidable. Thomas straightened, his professionalism beginning to crack under the pressure of Ruth's unwavering gaze. "I'll speak to her," he said, his voice firmer now, as though the decision alone was enough to resolve the matter. Ruth nodded, though she wasn't finished. "And I'd like you to consider what it means when someone like her feels comfortable saying those things in a place like this." The words landed with precision, their weight unmistakable. Thomas's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing as he turned and walked toward the waitress station. Ruth watched him go, her hands unclenching as she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. When Thomas reached Emma, the conversation was brief but heated. Emma gestured defensively, her voice low but sharp, while Thomas's expression hardened with each word. Ruth couldn't hear the exchange, but she didn't need to. She had seen this dance before: the denial, the deflection, the thin veneer of contrition that never quite reached sincerity. Emma approached Ruth's table moments later, her posture stiff, her face a study in barely concealed irritation. "I'm sorry if I offended you," she said, the words brittle and perfunctory. Ruth regarded her evenly, her expression calm but unyielding. "Offense isn't the issue," she replied. "Respect is." Emma's eyes flickered with something: anger, perhaps, or embarrassment, but she said nothing more before retreating to the kitchen. Ruth watched her go, the exchange leaving behind an ache that settled deep in her chest. The evening might have ended there, with Ruth reclaiming a sliver of dignity in the face of Emma's thinly veiled hostility. But the tension that had simmered beneath the surface now began to bubble over. Across the room, a couple whispered to one another, their eyes darting toward Ruth before quickly looking away. A man at the bar muttered something to his companion, their shared laughter sharp and pointed, and though no one said it aloud, Ruth could feel the shift, the invisible wall that separated her from them, the unspoken but undeniable truth that she was now the subject of their discomfort. She sat straighter in her chair, her chin lifting slightly, but the weight of their stares pressed down on her like a physical force. This, too, was familiar, the way a single act of defiance could turn a room against you, how quickly silence could become complicit. The storm broke when Marcus arrived. He entered the restaurant with the quiet authority of someone who belonged, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on Ruth. In an instant, his expression shifted from the easy confidence of a man in his element to the sharp concern of a son who knew something was wrong. "Mom," he said, his voice warm but laced with worry. "What happened?" Ruth gestured for him to sit, her calm demeanor masking the turmoil beneath. "Your waitress and I had a disagreement," she said carefully. Marcus frowned, his gaze flicking toward the kitchen where Emma lingered. "What kind of disagreement?" Ruth hesitated for only a moment before recounting the evening's events. Her words measured but pointed. Marcus listened in silence, his jaw tightening with each detail. When she finished, he stood, his expression unreadable. "Stay here," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken promises. And as Ruth watched him cross the room, she felt a quiet, bittersweet ache in her chest, not just for herself, but for him, for the fight he had inherited, for the battles he would face long after this one, and for the unspoken truth that even in the spaces they built, the fight for dignity was never truly over. The restaurant fell into a fragile quiet, the kind that exists on the edge of something inevitable. Ruth Ellis sat at her table, her composure intact but her mind heavy with the weight of the evening. Across the room, her son Marcus moved with purpose, his figure cutting through the muted elegance of the space like a blade. Every eye followed him, though no one dared to acknowledge it openly. When Marcus reached the kitchen entrance, the silence deepened, as if the entire restaurant held its breath. Ruth couldn't hear the conversation, but she didn't need to. She knew her son's voice well, the measured calm he had inherited from her, the firmness that came from years of navigating spaces that weren't always made for him. Marcus had learned early that strength didn't always mean raising your voice. Sometimes, it was the refusal to let the world diminish you. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours, before Marcus emerged with Thomas, the manager, trailing behind him. Emma was close behind, her face a mask of defiance thinly veiling discomfort. The three of them approached Ruth's table, their steps heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Marcus stood tall, his expression unreadable. "Mom," he said softly, his voice carrying both respect and resolve. "I've asked them to come here so we can address this properly." Thomas spoke first, his tone carefully diplomatic. "Mrs. Ellis, I want to apologize for the way you were treated tonight. This is not reflective of the values we hold at this establishment." Ruth's gaze remained steady, her silence compelling him to continue. "Emma has assured me that her comments were misunderstood." "But I wasn't misunderstood," Ruth interrupted, her voice calm but unyielding. Her words were clear, and so was her tone. Emma stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I didn't mean anything by it," she said, her voice edged with irritation. "It was just a bad night." Marcus's sharp glance silenced her, his authority palpable. "This isn't about a bad night," he said, his voice low but firm. "It's about how you chose to treat my mother, and by extension, what that says about how you see people like her." Emma's defiance faltered, her gaze darting between Marcus and Ruth. "I didn't mean it personally," she muttered, her words weak and unconvincing. "It was personal," Ruth said quietly. Her voice carried no anger, only truth. "It's always personal when someone decides you're less than they are. And it's personal when they think they can get away with treating you that way." The tension in the room was thick now, heavy enough to be felt by everyone within earshot. Marcus turned to Thomas, his tone measured but resolute. What happened tonight isn't just about my mother or Emma. It's about the culture you've allowed to take root here. If Emma felt comfortable saying what she said, it's because she believed there would be no consequences. Thomas's expression tightened, his discomfort evident. I take full responsibility for what happened tonight, he said, and I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. That's not enough, Marcus replied. His words were a challenge, but not an attack. It's not about damage control. It's about accountability. What are you going to do to ensure that everyone who walks through these doors feels respected? Not just my mother, but anyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. Thomas hesitated, his usual script of polite apologies failing him. Finally, he nodded. We'll implement better training for the staff, he said, though his words carried the hollow ring of an easy answer. Marcus didn't let him off the hook. Training isn't enough, he said. It's a start, but it won't fix a culture that allows this to happen. You need to lead by example. If your team doesn't see that respect is non-negotiable, no amount of training will matter. The room seemed to exhale as the conversation reached its peak. Emma, who had remained silent during Marcus's rebuke, finally spoke, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and regret. I didn't mean to make anyone feel unwelcome, she said. I didn't think. That's the problem, Ruth replied, her voice soft but pointed. You didn't think, because you didn't have to. People like me don't get that luxury. We carry the weight of your assumptions, your judgments. Every time we step into a room like this, Emma's shoulders slumped, her defiance crumbling into something closer to shame. She opened her mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it, nodding instead. When Thomas and Emma left, the weight of their absence was palpable. Marcus sat across from Ruth, his shoulders heavy with the burden of what had just transpired. I'm sorry, he said quietly, his voice laced with guilt. This isn't what I wanted for you tonight. Ruth reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his. It's not your fault, Marcus. You built something beautiful here, but beautiful things are always tested. What matters is how you respond. Marcus nodded, her words settling over him like a bomb. I just wanted this place to be different, he said, his voice thick with emotion. A place where people like us could feel seen. Ruth smiled, the kind of smile that carries both pride and sorrow. You've done that, she said. But the fight doesn't end because the doors are open. It just changes. As they sat together in the fading light of the evening, Ruth felt a quiet sense of resolution. The night had been a reckoning not just for Emma or Thomas, but for everyone in the room. It had exposed the cracks beneath the polished surface, the unspoken hierarchies that shaped so much of their world. But it had also shown her something else: the strength of her son, the power of his vision, and the enduring truth that dignity is not something to be given. It is something to be claimed. And tonight, Ruth Ellis had claimed hers. The restaurant seemed quieter now, but it wasn't peace, it was tension. The kind of silence that doesn't soothe but sharpens. An unspoken acknowledgement of the truth laid bare moments earlier. Ruth Ellis sat at her table, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Marcus had returned to the kitchen, his presence a beacon of calm authority in the storm. Yet the echoes of the confrontation lingered like smoke in the air. But the night wasn't over, and Ruth knew it. Moments like these rarely ended with a single reckoning. They rippled outward, touching everyone in ways both seen and unseen. And tonight, the ripples were already beginning to swell into waves. Across the room, Ruth caught snippets of hushed conversations. A couple seated near the bar exchanged glances, their whispers barely audible but their intent clear. "Why make it about race?" the woman murmured, her tone tinged with exasperation. Her companion nodded, his voice low but firm. "It's always the same. They read too much into things." Ruth didn't need to strain to hear them. She had heard versions of this conversation her entire life. The dismissal, the refusal to acknowledge what lay just beneath the surface, the insistence that the problem wasn't the act, but the reaction to it. It was always easier for people to question the person speaking up than to confront the systems that made speaking up necessary. When Marcus returned to the dining room, Ruth could see the weight on his shoulders. He moved with the precision of someone who understood the stakes, someone who knew that his every action, every word, would be scrutinized more harshly than most. As he approached her table, Ruth caught the fleeting look of regret in his eyes. "Mom," he began, his voice low, "I've spoken with Emma. She's—" Their conversation was interrupted by the sharp clatter of a chair across the room. A man in a gray suit, his face flushed with indignation, stood abruptly, his voice rising above the quiet. "This is ridiculous," he said, gesturing broadly. "You're running a restaurant, not a social justice seminar." Marcus turned to face him, his expression steady but watchful. "Is there a problem, sir?" he asked, his tone measured. The man laughed, though there was no humor in it. "A problem? Yeah. I'd say so. I came here for a nice dinner, not to watch a spectacle. All this fuss over what? Someone didn't get their food fast enough." Ruth felt her pulse quicken, but she remained silent. This, too, was familiar, the shifting of blame, the deliberate misunderstanding of what was at stake. She glanced at Marcus, her heart aching for the restraint she knew he would have to show. "This isn't about the food," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "It's about respect, and ensuring that everyone here is treated with the same dignity." The man scoffed, his derision cutting through the air. "Dignity? Give me a break. If you're so worried about making everyone feel welcome, maybe focus less on lectures and more on running this place properly." The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension thick enough to taste. Ruth felt the weight of every eye on Marcus, every unspoken judgment hanging in the air. She wanted to speak, to stand up and tell this man exactly what she thought of his arrogance, his entitlement, but she didn't. Instead, she watched Marcus, knowing that this was his moment, his fight to navigate. Marcus stepped closer to the man, his posture steady, his gaze unflinching. "I appreciate your feedback," he said, his tone as even as ever. "But this isn't a lecture. It's a commitment to the values this restaurant stands for." The man shook his head, muttering something under his breath that Ruth couldn't make out but understood well enough. He grabbed his coat from the back of his chair and tossed a handful of cash onto the table. "Enjoy your values," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he stormed toward the exit. The tension in the room didn't dissipate with the man's departure. If anything, it deepened, the air charged with the unspoken question of who would be next to speak or act. Ruth looked around, noting the mixture of expressions on the faces of the other diners. Some looked uncomfortable, others defiant, and still others merely curious, as though this were all a show for their entertainment. Finally, a voice broke the silence. "He's right. You know." It came from a woman seated near the back, her tone hesitant but clear. "Not about the fuss, but about the point. I mean, why does everything have to be about race?" Ruth turned slowly to face her, her expression calm but sharp. "Because everything is about race," she said quietly. Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of lived experience. "It always has been. The only difference is who gets to pretend it isn't." The woman flushed but said nothing, her gaze dropping to the table. Ruth felt no satisfaction in silencing her. The truth was not meant to be a weapon. It was simply a mirror, one that some people refused to look into. As the room began to settle, Marcus returned to Ruth's side, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Ruth nodded, though her heart felt heavier than before. "I'm fine," she said. "But you're carrying too much." "Marcus." Marcus shook his head. "I knew what I was signing up for," he said. "But it's not fair that you had to deal with this tonight." "Fairness isn't the point," Ruth replied, her voice firm. "It never has been. The point is whether you keep standing, even when it isn't fair." Marcus nodded, her words settling into the space between them like a quiet promise. That night, as Ruth left the restaurant, she looked back one last time. The lights inside glowed warmly, the hum of conversation returning to its usual rhythm. But she knew the ripples of the evening would linger within the walls of that restaurant, within the hearts of those who had witnessed it, and within her son. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But for tonight, Ruth took solace in knowing that they had faced it together, and that, no matter how heavy the burden, they would continue to stand. The air outside the restaurant was cooler now, the night pressing in with a quiet intensity that mirrored the atmosphere inside. Ruth Ellis stood at the curb, waiting as Marcus finished speaking to his staff. She had intended to leave, to slip away quietly as she often did. But something held her there, tethering her to the moment. She could feel the weight of the evening settling over her, each moment replaying in her mind like a reel of film she couldn't pause. When Marcus emerged, his shoulders were squared, his expression composed. But Ruth saw through it. She always had. She gestured toward the bench by the curb, and without a word, they sat together. The street was quieter now, the hum of the city dulled by distance. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I thought opening this place would mean something," Marcus said finally, his voice low but steady. "I thought it would prove something." Ruth turned to him, her gaze gentle but firm. "And it does," she said. "But you know better than anyone that proof doesn't change minds. Not by itself." Marcus exhaled, the sound heavy with frustration. "Then what does?" he asked, his voice tinged with a weariness that Ruth recognized too well. "Time," she said simply, "and persistence." Inside the restaurant, the night's events continued to ripple outward. The staff had gathered in the dining room, their usual end-of-shift routines paused for an impromptu meeting. Marcus stood at the center, his presence commanding but calm. Tonight was a failure, he began, his voice steady. Not because of what happened, but because of how it happened. The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over the group like a heavy blanket. Emma stood off to the side, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression a mixture of defiance and discomfort. Marcus continued, his gaze sweeping over the staff. We failed because someone in this room thought it was acceptable to treat a guest with anything less than respect. We failed because that treatment wasn't just about bad service, it was about something deeper, something uglier. He paused, letting the words sink in. And we failed because we let it happen, because no one stepped in to stop it. Emma's voice broke the silence, sharp and defensive. I said I was sorry, she said, her tone clipped. What more do you want from me? Marcus turned to her, his expression unflinching. I want you to understand why what you did was wrong, he said. I want you to take responsibility not just for what you said, but for what it means. Emma scoffed, her frustration bubbling to the surface. I didn't mean anything by it, she said. It was just a mistake. No, Marcus said firmly. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice. And whether you realize it or not, that choice had consequences. The room was still, the tension thick enough to cut. Emma opened her mouth to respond, but Marcus held up a hand, stopping her. This isn't just about my mother, he said. It's about every person who's ever walked through these doors and been made to feel like they didn't belong. It's about what this restaurant stands for and what it doesn't. The staff shifted uncomfortably, their silence speaking volumes. Marcus turned to the rest of the group, his tone softening but losing none of its urgency. I need all of you to think about what kind of place this is, he said. What kind of place you want it to be. Because it's not enough to hang a sign on the door and say everyone's welcome. You have to live it. You have to mean it. He paused, his gaze lingering on each face. That means confronting your own biases, even the ones you don't want to admit you have. It means standing up when you see something wrong, even when it's uncomfortable, especially then. Outside, Ruth sat quietly, listening to the faint sounds of the city around her. She thought about the man who had stormed out earlier, his indignation echoing in her mind. She thought about the woman who had questioned why race had to be part of the conversation. And she thought about Emma, whose words had cut deeply, not because they were new, but because they were so painfully familiar. When Marcus returned, his face was drawn, his steps slower than before. He sat beside her without speaking, his head bowed slightly as though the weight of the night had finally settled on him. You did well, Ruth said softly, breaking the silence. Marcus looked at her, his expression a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. It doesn't feel like it, he admitted. Ruth smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth barely lifting. It never does, she said. But that's not the point. The point is that you did what needed to be done. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement as they sat together, mother and son, united by the quiet resilience that had carried them both through so many battles. Ruth reached for Marcus's hand, her touch light but steady. You can't fix everything, Marcus, she said, but you can set a standard, and you can hold people to it. Marcus nodded, her words sinking in. He knew she was right. The fight wasn't over, not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever. But for now, he could take solace in knowing that they had faced it together, that they had stood their ground. And as they rose to leave, the night stretching out before them, Ruth felt a quiet certainty take root in her chest. The fight would go on. But so would they, together. The restaurant doors closed with a soft click behind Marcus. But the weight of the evening lingered on his shoulders as he stepped into the cool night air. Ruth walked beside him, her posture steady, her presence a quiet reminder of the resilience that had carried her through decades of storms. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was contemplative, charged with the unspoken truths they both understood too well. "Do you remember?" Ruth began after a moment, her voice low but steady. "The time I came to your classroom when you were in the second grade?" Marcus frowned slightly, searching his memory. "The spelling bee," he said finally, a faint smile touching his lips. "I was supposed to win, but Mrs. Hathaway said my handwriting was too messy." Ruth nodded, her expression unreadable. "And do you remember what she said to me when I asked her why?" Marcus paused, the memory surfacing with sharp clarity. "Children like him need to learn discipline first." His voice was tight, anger flickering in the corners of his tone even now. Ruth's gaze stayed fixed ahead, her face calm but her eyes hard. "I had to sit there and listen to her tell me that you didn't deserve what you'd earned, not because of your skill, but because of who she thought you were." Marcus stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "And you didn't let her get away with it." "No," Ruth said simply, her voice carrying the weight of years. "But do you know what stayed with me the most? It wasn't what she said. It was the look on her face when she realized I wouldn't back down. That moment of surprise. Like she couldn't believe I had the audacity to demand what was already yours." They continued walking, the streetlights casting their shadows long and thin across the pavement. Ruth's story lingered in Marcus's mind, intertwining with the events of the night. He thought of Emma's dismissiveness, the man's indignation, the whispers of diners who couldn't or wouldn't see the truth staring them in the face. He thought of how often the fight for dignity began not with a shout, but with the smallest of acts. A question asked, a line drawn, a silence broken. "Do you ever get tired of it?" Marcus asked suddenly, his voice quiet but insistent. "The fight? The way it never seems to end." Ruth stopped walking, turning to face him. Her expression was calm, but her eyes shone with something fierce and unyielding. "Of course I get tired," she said, "but tired isn't the same as finished." Back at the restaurant, the staff lingered in the quiet dining room, their usual routines disrupted by the events of the night. Thomas, the manager, stood near the bar, his tie loosened, his expression heavy with thought. Emma sat alone at a corner table, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face drawn with a mixture of guilt and defiance. The others spoke in hushed tones, their words fragmented but tinged with tension. "I mean, she didn't mean anything by it," one server said quietly, glancing toward Emma. "But still, it wasn't right." "Not right," another replied, her voice sharper. "It was racist. Call it what it is." Emma's head snapped up at that, her eyes narrowing. "It wasn't racist," she said sharply. "I was having a bad day. People make everything about race these days." The room fell silent at her words, the weight of them hanging heavily in the air. Thomas cleared his throat, stepping forward hesitantly. "Emma," he began, his voice cautious, "it's not about what you meant. It's about how it came across, and how it made Mrs. Ellis feel." Emma's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze dropping to the table. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "I just didn't think." That's the problem. One of the other servers said, their tone softer now. You didn't think. And maybe you should. Outside, Marcus and Ruth reached her car, the cool air brushing against their skin. Marcus leaned against the hood, his arms crossed, his thoughts heavy. I want to believe it's getting better, he said finally. But nights like this make me wonder, how much has really changed? Ruth didn't answer immediately. She opened her purse, searching for her keys, before turning back to him. Change doesn't happen all at once, she said. It happens in pieces, small ones, and sometimes you don't see the results until long after the fight. Marcus nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. Ruth placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch light but firm. What matters is that you keep pushing, not because it's easy, or because it'll fix everything, but because it's right. Back inside, the conversation among the staff continued, the air thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Thomas finally spoke, his voice steady but firm. This isn't just about tonight, he said, addressing the group. It's about what kind of place we want this to be, what kind of people we want to be. He paused, his gaze lingering on Emma. We can't control how the world treats people outside these walls, but in here, we set the standard, and that standard is respect for everyone. Emma shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her defenses visibly cracking. She opened her mouth as if to argue but stopped, her words faltering before they began. Instead, she nodded slowly, her posture softening. As Marcus and Ruth prepared to part ways for the evening, Ruth turned to him one last time, her gaze steady. You're doing more than you know, she said. Every time you speak up, every time you hold someone accountable, you're planting seeds, and one day, those seeds will grow. Marcus nodded, her words settling into his chest like a quiet truth. I just hope I live to see it, he said softly. Ruth smiled faintly, her expression a mixture of pride and sorrow. You will, she said. And even if you don't, you'll know you did everything you could. They stood together for a moment longer, the night stretching out before them, heavy with the promise of more battles to come. But for now, there was peace in the understanding that the fight was worth it and that they were not alone in it. The morning light spilled through Ruth Ellis's curtains, soft and golden, painting her modest living room in hues of quiet warmth. She sat at the small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, her thoughts still heavy with the events of the previous night. Outside, the world hummed on as it always did, indifferent to the battles waged within it. Ruth's phone buzzed softly on the table, breaking her reverie. She glanced at the screen, recognizing Marcus's name. A faint smile touched her lips as she picked up. Good morning, son, she said, her voice steady but tinged with warmth. Morning, Mom, Marcus replied. His tone was lighter than the night before, though she could still hear the undercurrent of exhaustion. I just wanted to check in. How are you feeling? Ruth paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. I'm fine, she said simply. But the real question is, how are you? There was a beat of silence on the other end, and then a soft laugh. Tired, Marcus admitted. But I've been thinking about what you said about planting seeds. I guess I'm just hoping they'll grow. Ruth's smile widened, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. They will, she said firmly. But growth takes time, and sometimes, the soil isn't as fertile as we'd like. At the restaurant, the day began as any other. The staff moved through their opening routines, their motions brisk and efficient. But there was a quiet tension in the air, a lingering heaviness from the night before. Emma arrived late, her posture stiff, her expression guarded. She avoided eye contact as she slipped on her apron and headed toward the kitchen. Thomas watched her from across the room, his brow furrowed. He approached her cautiously, his voice low but firm. "Emma," he said, "can we talk for a minute?" Emma hesitated, her shoulders tensing, but she nodded and followed him to the office. The small space felt even smaller as they sat across from one another, the air thick with unspoken words. "I need you to understand something," Thomas began, his tone measured. "What happened last night wasn't just a bad day or a mistake. It was a moment where you made someone feel like they didn't belong. And that's not who we are not here." Emma looked down, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said quietly. "I believe you," Thomas said. "But that doesn't change what happened. And it doesn't change the fact that you need to do better." Meanwhile, Marcus arrived at the restaurant, his steps purposeful but not hurried. He paused outside, taking a moment to collect himself before stepping inside. The staff greeted him with quiet nods, their usual chatter subdued. Marcus made his way to the kitchen, where Ruth sat at a small table, her presence unexpected but welcome. "Mom," Marcus said, his surprise evident. "What are you doing here?" Ruth smiled faintly, her hands folded neatly on the table. "I thought I'd see how things look in the daylight," she said. "And I thought you might need some support." Marcus's expression softened, and he sat beside her. "Always," he said simply. They sat together in silence for a moment, the quiet hum of the kitchen around them. Then Ruth spoke, her voice low but firm. "What happened last night wasn't just about Emma. It was about everyone in that room, about what they see, and what they refuse to see." Marcus nodded, her words sinking in. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here, to make sure they do see." In the dining room, the staff gathered once more, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. Marcus stood at the center, his presence calm but commanding. Ruth watched from the sidelines, her gaze steady, her pride evident. "I want to talk about last night," Marcus began, his voice even but firm. "Not to rehash what happened, but to talk about what it means and where we go from here." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "This restaurant isn't just a business to me. It's a reflection of the values I was raised with: respect, dignity, and the belief that everyone deserves a place at the table. But last night, we fell short of those values." The staff listened intently, their expressions shifting as his words took hold. Marcus continued, his tone softening but losing none of its urgency. "It's not enough to say we're inclusive. We have to show it in how we treat our guests, in how we treat each other, and in how we respond when we fall short." He turned to Emma, his gaze steady but not unkind. "Emma, I know last night was hard, but it's in moments like those that we have a choice, to double down on our mistakes, or to learn from them and grow." Emma looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time. "I want to do better," she said softly. I don't know where to start." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You start by listening, by recognizing that your words and actions have power, and by being willing to challenge the assumptions you've been taught." As the meeting ended, the staff dispersed, their conversations quieter but more purposeful. Ruth approached Marcus, her steps slow but steady. "You did well," she said simply. Marcus smiled faintly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time that day. "I'm trying," he said. Ruth placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but firm. "Trying is where it starts," she said. "And if you keep trying, you'll get there." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the restaurant buzzed with quiet activity. Diners filled the tables, their laughter and conversation blending into a warm hum. Marcus stood near the bar, watching as the staff moved with a newfound sense of purpose. Even Emma seemed lighter, her movements more deliberate, her interactions more thoughtful. Ruth sat at her usual table by the window, a quiet smile on her lips as she sipped her coffee. She watched Marcus from across the room, her heart swelling with pride and hope. The fight wasn't over, she knew it never would be. But tonight felt like a step forward. And sometimes, Ruth thought, a single step was all it took to begin the journey.